Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here, and one of the to have especially all of you who are guests of Estonia to this country where we value human rights and individual liberty and freedom more than is common for what is called the post-Soviet space. Or should I say, one of the places where I think we value these things more than almost anywhere else, because we don't take it for granted. The concept of human dignity, of the inherent value of each individual, is one of the cornerstones of modern democratic societies. This idea, we know, most of us know, comes from the Enlightenment, first the Scottish and then the French Enlightenment. But it's also argued that it has deeper roots. The British philosopher Larry Zaidentop finds or claims that the source of modern humanism lies actually in early Christianity, saying that the initial legends of God being born through man led slowly to the conception of each human being having a soul. And ideally, an idea that is radically alien to those ancient societies, or even some modern ones, where it was taken for granted that humans could be owned by other humans. They could be bought and sold, tortured, and killed at their whim. But it took centuries before early Christian universalism materialized in real political institutions. It took even longer before such ideas developed into the concept of universal human rights that we all take for granted today. We can trace it, of course, to John Locke and the concept of inalienable rights, first promulgated actually politically in the United States. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, accepted in the United Nations 66 years ago, is a truly universal document, which is accepted, at least, accepted in sort of a nodding form by all 193 members of the United Nations, and is no longer specific to one culture, religion, or civilization. Or we would like to think so, that all humans are entitled to human dignity, that every person's basic rights are to be respected no matter where they live, no matter in which country and under which regime they happen to be born. Respect for human rights is one of the founding principles of all international institutions and alliances that we belong to. It is the foundation of the national constitutions of all democratic states. In international relations, there has been a long tension between two central ideas: the sovereignty of nations and the respect for human rights. Our international order was guided for a long time by the Treaty of Westphalia from 1648 that ended one of the bloodiest and longest wars in European history, the 30 Years' War, which in turn was based on the 1555 Treaty of Augsburg. It was signed in an attempt to solve the 30 Years' War, as I said, and it established the principle, cuius regio eius religio, whose realm, his religion. So your prince got to decide whether you're a Protestant or a Catholic, basically, is what it meant at the time. But this principle, besides settling what was a horrible and bloody religious war, or long-term set of wars, has formed the basis of the idea, the modern idea of sovereignty. And to those of you who have seen, who have read Henry Kissinger's latest book, New World Order, which just came out about a month and a half ago, you know that he basically has never stopped being a Westphalian and argues to this point, to this day, that that is the principle we need, that is an ordering principle. But of course, this leads to its own problems. And the problem is that anything you do inside your state, according to this concept, is permissible. Thus, violations of human rights within the borders of one's own state has been difficult to interfere with. International human rights organizations have tried to change that, and we have come up with the idea of humanitarian intervention. Later, that was enshrined as R2P, as it's known, or responsibility to protect. The problem is, of course, that whenever you have principles like these, they can also be abused and used as abused by countries that would then willfully misinterpret the idea behind these things, behind these concepts, and use them for their own ends. So we see today that the humanitarian invention in the case of saving Kosovars a decade ago or more already, is now in this new world of irreality used to protect non-existent refugees from Ukraine. So we're always on a slippery slope in these things. I've called the year 2014 an annus horribilis, as opposed to the annus mirabilis of 25 years ago, almost exactly this fall, that gave our part of the world the chance to opt for freedom and democracy. I really hate numerology, but it is really odd to see here that a quarter of a century after the amazing flowering of democracy throughout Eastern Europe, that we have its rollback happening right before our eyes. And now, what do we see? The worst ghosts of the 20th century are returning. We've seen the annexation of territory through force. We've seen new forms of war waged under the cover of old ideological and long discredited ideas, such as the existence of co-ethnics abroad or in a different country, and the alleged need to protect them from their bloodthirsty but still democratically elected governments. Russia's actions in Ukraine have basically violated all of the international agreements that the post-Cold War and even post-war security order have relied on to maintain peace, starting with the Charter of the United Nations from 1945, which says members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state, unquote. Beginning with that in 1994 to the Budapest Memorandum, that in 1945, ending with the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, under which Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for promises to respect this territory. In that space, we have seen, in that time period, we have seen everything rolled back, or rather, we've seen everything rolled back from that time period. One of the agreements that was that I think I'm most worried about that has been violated was the crucial agreement that reconciled sovereignty with human rights, known as the Helsinki Final Act from 1975, which said, on the one hand, there would be no more changing of, there could be no changing of borders through use of force or threat of use of force, and that, in fact, oddly enough, was the Soviet side of the argument. That was a demand on the part of the Soviet Union that the West accept that no border changes take place. The West, in turn, in this grand bargain of security and human rights and sovereignty, insisted on the third basket, which basically said that states party to the Helsinki Final Act would have to allow and guarantee fundamental human rights, including the ones we hold most dear, such as freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. The annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine just shows us that the Helsinki Final Act no longer applies, because basically one signatory has violated and nothing has really happened as a result of that. And in the whole process, it's not only the Anschluss, which a term I use very specifically, the Anschluss of Crimea, but also the war in East Ukraine and the rhetoric that goes with it, the intimidation of other neighbors and threats addressed to the West at large, show that there is an ongoing attempt to create a new international order, where the old rules of not changing borders, the old rules, the rules that have basically been at the basis of international relations in at least from Vancouver to Vladivostok, that those rules no longer apply. I'm personally most concerned about the Zwischenländer, the countries in between, those countries between NATO and Russia, that there will be an attempt to form spheres of influence there, where, in fact, the democratic choice of those countries in the Zwischenländer really don't have a say as to what they can do, or have a say about their future. And this, I would argue, is a major denial of human dignity. That this is actually one of the arguments advanced by a number of people, from Kissinger to Brzezinski, is that, well, the people there in Ukraine actually shouldn't have their choice. Recently, I saw the German foreign minister himself say that Ukraine will never join NATO. The question is, what happens if people use their democratic right to elect a government that would like to do something like such as join NATO or join the European Union or whatever, and if they meet the criteria, then those people, that country, that nation has been denied the right to actually exercise their democratic choice. I find that very bizarre when we in the West are saying things like that we won't give you that right. But since we've been there, we Estonians, we know all about it, and which is probably one reason why we're more against it. One of the things that I also like to address, which I find really quite unnerving the more it goes on, is that the concept of human rights is increasingly being civilizationalized. Recalling again, we're talking about the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that beginning, I guess, with Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore in the late 80s, and increasingly by any number of countries, we see the argument made that, well, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of the press, those are all civilizational human rights. That, well, you people in the West, you can have that, but our culture is more collectivist, and we don't have that. We see this in the speech last week, the State of the Nation speech by the president of our neighboring Russian Federation, that freedom is first and foremost for the state, and in last place, freedom for the citizens. That's a more or less quote. And we see a civilizational confrontation coming up, where there is Slavic culture, tough, traditional, and proud, based on orthodoxy, autocracy, and narodnost, as the Tsar Nicholas I once pronounced it, is something which is in opposition to weak, decadent democracies that rely on rule of law, that offer protection for various minorities, including ones based on sexual choice. And so we see this harsh rhetoric in civilizational terms, denying what we thought was a universalist human rights tradition. And this, in fact, I would argue, would lead to a dilution of, or perhaps a diminution of the concept of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But this does, to bring together two concepts, this does lead to kind of a Westphalianization of human rights. And in this new vision, security, democracy, rule of law, human rights would be given a civilizational status. It would mean that here in this part of the world, in Europe, in North America, in Australia, Japan, we would have an Enlightenment-based cultural space that respects human rights as we understand them. In the East, there would be a post-Soviet, Slavic, and Orthodox space that finds the Western doctrine of human rights unsuitable. And consequently, all that follows from that in terms of rule of law, instead of cuius regio eius religio, we now have cuius regio eius justitia. Making human rights a civilizational issue, culturally suitable for some but not others, is a Huntingtonian, and that is as in Samuel Huntington, Huntingtonian idea turned upside down. Samuel Huntington's theory of clash of civilization was a descriptive account, a worrisome descriptive account of the way things could go. I get a feeling that it's being taken not as a descriptive, but rather as a prescriptive account. Let's read Huntington and see how we can follow Huntington to make our civilizational arguments. It's not meant as a textbook, folks. Restoring and protecting the international order that we've known is a matter of security, but also of human dignity. If the West would take the attitude that some Western thinkers do support, to accept the annexation of Crimea and the frozen conflicts created in Ukraine's east, if we accept Russia's droit de regard over Ukraine, then we would accept that Ukrainians have no say over their own future, over their own alliances, which of course also violates the Paris Charter of 1990, another one of the recently broken international agreements signed by Russia's legal predecessor. And we'd have to accept that human rights are not universal, that they are a privilege of the people who belong to certain civilizations, not a universal value derived from the notion of human dignity that belongs to all human beings. It would mean that we would accept the rights of some people, and then in the case of other people, such as Ukrainians and Crimean Tatar, their rights don't matter. Compounded by my fear that people don't realize this enough, even in Europe, and say, let's go back to business as usual and let's keep making money. So I personally don't think this is really an option. We experienced this colonialist attitude for such a long time that we remember it quite well, and we certainly believe that all people should have the right to fundamental dignity. Let's not forget that the fundamental task of the European Union is to protect human rights, the rule of law, peace, and security on the European continent. We need to get back to that core task. Worry a little bit less about how much profit you can make by selling out the values of Europe and get back to the values that, in fact, underlie this union of ours. And we need to use the tools that we have developed over the years to insist on observing human rights. So when you grapple with these issues here, let's also keep in mind that the notion of dignity is something that also is strongly tied to the status of human beings, regardless of where they live or their cultural origins. Recognizing the right of indigenous peoples to preserve their cultural identity is an important part of human rights thinking. Unfortunately, in many countries, material gains of majorities or elites are often prioritized over the fundamental rights of minorities. Thus, let us remember that the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples is a form of wealth that outweighs the economic profit that can be gained by exploiting the natural resources in the areas where they live. This is especially important from our point of view in the areas of our Finno-Ugric relatives, but also elsewhere in the world. And we are moreover very concerned when we read reports, as I did last week, that books written in non-Russian languages for people over the age, after 5th grade, are now being proscribed. This is will be a clear end to the very many small nations of Russia whose languages we must keep alive. And so this is why we Estonians relate to the plight of indigenous peoples, not just because we are a small nation that has lived under many foreign rulers, but also because we've lived on our territory for several thousand years. We are an indigenous people, though by the definition of the UN, because we have our own country, we're no longer indigenous. I'm not quite sure I follow that logic, but in any case, so for us, all of these things matter. Today, democratic Estonia is home to people of hundreds of ethnicities, and all of them have their human rights protected. We see no difference between large and small, important or less important peoples. We know and have felt the fear of extinction. We have strong sympathy to those people who are not yet or no longer free. And today, we feel especially strongly for the Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of the annexed peninsula, who today are in a most vulnerable position. They have no other home, no other place where they can cherish their cultural heritage. And it is the responsibility of all democratic countries in the world to protect the rights of small nations to exist and flourish. We cannot leave anyone hostage to a world where someone else could decide that human rights are not part of their culture. And as a coda, I would say this much, that there's one more abuse, I think, that we have to be increasingly aware of today. It's another part of the heritage of the Enlightenment that has not come under threat until, I would say, in such a massive way until this year, which is actually the fundamental aspect of the Scottish Enlightenment of empiricism. It's also known as British empiricism, but there is such a thing as observable truth. And what we see in the world that we're in is a postmodernist counterattack against that part of the Enlightenment again, as well, which is that a denial of the idea of objective truth, that everything is possible and nothing is real, to quote the title of a book that has appeared in the US and soon will appear here in Europe as well, by Peter Pomerantsev. When we begin to question the validity of data, of evidence, which is part of the ongoing war, information war that we see today, then the entire civilizational enterprise that we're a part of here, that has brought us human rights, can undergo collapse. So be aware of what's going on and realize that it's not only even your right to speak that is under threat in many places, but even the concept of truth itself. Ponder that, I hope, during your time here. And to all of you who have never been to Estonia, welcome to Estonia. Enjoy your stay. Have fruitful discussions. Thank you very much.